After learning about vegetative propagation and asexual reproduction in plants, its sexual reproduction in plants, flower is the reproductive organ of the plant, and in it lies the male and female parts. If the male and female parts are in the same flower, it's called bisexual flower. But if they are separate, one male flower and then there is another female flower, then it is a unisexual flower. Now let's study the structure of flower in detail.
Hi there, boys and girls. Welcome to today's vodcast on the structures and functions of the flower. So first thing we have to know is that the flower is a reproductive structure of an angiosperm, and there's two main sections of a flower. And a flower could be one of three things. It could be a male flower, it could be a female flower, or it can be a flower that contains both male and female structures. So let's review what those male and female structures are. The first part that we're going to talk about is the male structure, and that's called the stamen. The stamen is easy to remember that it's male because the word is spelt with M-E-N at the end. So it actually spells out the word men. So if you can remember that men are males, then you'll remember that stamen is the male part. Now, as the male part of the flower, the stamen's main job is to produce grains of pollen. And pollen are structures that contain the sperm cells for the flower. So the goal is to get the sperm of this flower into the eggs of another flower, or maybe even the same flower that the sperm was made on. So to take a closer look at what pollen looks like, we'll take a peek at this picture here. Now this is a picture of a bee that's obviously been hunting for nectar or food out in flowers and been walking around in them. And as you can see, there's a bunch of yellow spheres located all over the bee, stuck in its fur and so forth. This is pollen. This is what pollen looks like up close. So those are the pollen structures of a flower. Now the pollen of a flower is produced by a structure called the anther. And the anther is this structure here at the top of this thin stalk. And this thin stalk is called the filament. And the filament's main job is to support the anther, to hold it up. This way the wind or different agents of pollination like butterflies and bees can bump into the anther and get pollen all over themselves. So pollen can easily be dispersed. So the anther and the filament make up the male structures of the flower, which is called the stamen. Now when the pollen is being transferred, it's going to end up on the female parts of the flower. And the female parts of the flower is called the pistil. And the pistil includes the following structures. We have the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then inside the ovaries we have our ovules. So we'll start at the top of the stigma. The main structure of the stigma is to collect the pollen. So when the pollen is brushed up against it by a pollinator or through the wind, the pollen grains are going to stick on the stigma, and then the pollen grains will release the sperm cells on the stigma there. And we'll take a closer look on how that happens later. Now, the sperm cells released from the pollen on the stigma now move down this long, slender tube going deep inside the flower, and this part of the flower is called the style. The style is the tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. And then when we get down to the bottom of the style, we have this rounded structure called the ovary, and the ovary's main function is to contain and protect the ovules. Now you might be wondering, well, what's so great about the ovules? Why do they need protection? Well, don't forget, the ovules are the female parts of the flower, so the ovules are going to house the eggs that are needed for fertilization. So those are the different parts of the flower. Let's take a look.
We have the first process in it, pollination. Where pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the flower to the stigma of a flower. That means the male gametes are taken from stamen to the female gamete in the pistil. This the flower can do, or the plant can do, in two ways: cross-pollination or self-pollination. In self-pollination, the plant pollinates itself. Here, the anthers or pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or to another flower but of the same plant. The plant remains the same. So, pollen grains are taken from the anther to the stigma. Now, in self-pollination, there is less wastage of energy by the plant, as there is no need of beautiful flowers, scent or nectar. So plant doesn't waste energy on producing large pollen grains or sticky pollen grains or huge amount of pollen grains. So the plant saves on energy and wastage. Then, since there is no need of external agents to carry the pollen grains, the plant is doing itself. So it is not dependent upon external factors. It becomes independent. Plant becomes independent. And of course, in self-pollination, since the same plant is involved, so this maintains the purity of the new generation, because it will be similar to the parent, as anthers or male gametes and ovum or ovary, the female gamete, are from the same plant. But the disadvantage here is that variations are not possible, as there is no mixing of new plants or new genes over here. So there are no new varieties possible. Plus, if the parent plant had certain diseases or certain negative factors, that will be carried on by the new daughter plants as well. But in cross-pollination, the other method of pollination, it means the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but of a different plant, though of same species. The plant is the same type, like if it is a rose plant, the anther of one rose plant will be carried to stigma of another rose plant. The plant remains the same, the plant variety remains the same, but the plants are different. So that is cross-pollination. Since this involves a lot of movement from one plant to another plant of the same type, it needs certain special external agents like wind, water, animals, human beings, insects, and so on. So in cross-pollination, there are disadvantages, because the plant has to put on big showy flowers, nectars it should have, sweet scent it should have. So it wastes lots of its energy in making itself attractive to the external agents. It produces lots of pollen, which may be small, light, so that it can be carried by wind or water. So this way the plant wastes lots of energy in this. Plus, since the plants are different, the purity of the parent plant cannot be maintained here. But the advantage over here is that there will be new varieties possible. Since there are mixing of characters, so new varieties can be created through cross-pollination. As well as, if the parent had any disease, it can be overcome through cross-pollination. So that is about cross-pollination. Now, how does cross-pollination is brought about? This is brought about by external agents like insects. Entomophily it is called as. This kind of pollination is called as entomophily. In this kind of pollination, the flowers are mostly beautiful, bright, like the hibiscus flower I have drawn here. The petals are big, large, colored, showy. Stigmas are sticky, prominent. Pollen grains are also produced in huge amounts. Plus, they are again sticky. A flower has nice smell, sweet smell. It will have to produce lots of nectar. This it does in order to attract insects towards itself. so that when the insect sits on the flower, pollen grains may stick to its body, and when it sits on another flower of the same plant, those pollen grains are picked up by the stigma, bringing about cross-pollination. So this is about entomophily. Then the second agent is wind. This kind of pollination is called as anemophily. In such plants, there are certain adaptations. Here, the flowers are not showy or very big in size. They are small, very inconspicuous, tiny in size, but their stigmas or their pistils and stamens are specially developed because they have to transfer through wind. So here the stigmas are, you can see here, feathery, so that, or hairy, brushy, so that they can catch pollen grains flying in the wind, while anthers or stamens have long filaments to hang outside the flower. Long filament to hang outside the flower. The pollens are loosely hanging on the anthers. Anthers itself are very long, thread-like, so that they can break easily away in the wind, and pollen grains are produced in huge amounts. They are very light, dry, small in size, so that they are easily carried away by the wind. So you can see such flowers are found in wheat, grasses, rice, etc. Then the last type of pollination is water pollination. This is called as hydrophily. In this pollination, the plants adapt to living in water, and here mostly the male and female flowers are found in different plants, and they have different time of maturing. So male flowers mature first. They are found much below the water level, and once they mature, they break, they become waterproof, light, and they float on the surface of water. The female flowers are found in another plant. When they are immature, they are twisted and held to the bottom of the water structure, and once they are mature, the spiral stem opens up and brings them to the surface of water, and the female flowers come in contact with the male flowers flowing in the water. So here the whole flower gets detached and taken up by the water flow. This is found in Vallisneria, hydrilla, but not in other hydrophytes like lotus, water lily, water chestnut. There the flowers are big, showy, and entomophily is carried out by them. But in Vallisneria, hydrilla, the submerged water plants, hydrophily is done. Artificial pollination or hybridization is done by man to produce high yielding and disease resistant varieties of plants which grow and mature early with better quality of flowers, fruits, grains, cereals to satisfy increasing human population. In this, plants with desired characteristics are selected. In bisexual flowers, one flower is emasculated, male stamens are removed, that means, and then from the other desired plant, pollen grains are dusted upon the female stigma of the emasculated flower, bringing artificial pollination. Then it is covered with bags to avoid contamination from other sources, and then it is grown further to produce seeds. Hybrid plants are produced this way. After pollination comes fertilization, fusion of male gamete with a female gamete. The pollens on reaching stigma grow a pollen tube into which male gametes two male gametes are formed and carried inside ovary to the ovule to fuse with the female gamete, forming a zygote, which later on becomes an embryo inside the seed, that is, the fertilized ovule. The ovary becomes a fruit, and these fruits may be fleshy or juicy, fleshy and juicy like mango, dry, stony and hard like in gram or wheat. And this completes sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and that is the last topic of reproduction in plants.